Just want to share with you a book that I was recently introduced to. This is a book by an author named Nicholas Christakis, who is a Yale professor of sociology, and he is a medical doctor. Rare combination of talents. And Nicholas has written a book called Apollo's Arrow. Now, Nicholas has spent his entire career focusing on how societies like the United States adapt to things like pandemics, how they adapt to things like plagues, how they adapt to wars. How do societies move through things like what we are experiencing now? It's interesting. He says that this is what tends to happen with healthy societies like ours. The first thing is that people become more independent through these crises. You may have found that to be the case. Many people are now cutting their own hair rather than going and having it cut. As you can see, I'm in bad need of doing myself. People are making their own meals. People are fixing their own bikes and dishwashers and what have you. People have become more independent. He says, second, people begin to think in new ways when crises like this happen. So one example of this is most sociologists say that our society will no longer have a connection to the workplace as a tangible place to go ever again after this. That people will have an office, but working away will be the new norm. That schools and universities will change overnight. That people will not be going to schools, they will be going online. So there's new thinking. Nicholas also says that people tend to become more religious during times like these. It's the old foxhole theory, that nobody is an atheist in a foxhole, and that maybe you have found and your friends have found that this is a time when you have come closer to God. Here's the point I want to make. The hardest choice that any society has to make when there is an oppressive force coming from the outside, like a pandemic, is whether or not to collaborate. That is, whether or not they will lay down their arms and their swords, and they will lock arms and they will work together against that thing that is oppressing them. Again, the hardest choices in our lives come at the hardest times of our lives. I'm speaking just to parents here now, but I don't know about you, but this has been the hardest time for me to get my kids to do their online Zoom classes and then to do their homework. I talked about it last week. I logged my daughter into the wrong Spanish class, but then there's homework on top of that. And again, like many of you, I've tried everything. I've tried like detention, which is tough in the house. I've tried to send them to the principal's office, which never works. That's me. But I've learned something known as the incentive. I'll say to them, all right, kids, if you do your homework, you will get an ice cream cone. Now, here's the thing. 99.9% of the time, I will give them an ice cream cone even if they don't do all of their homework. But I want to give them an incentive, and usually that is an incentive for them to do more than they would have. This is what God is giving you and I, an incentive. God will pour down blessings upon us no matter whether you and I give or not. That's God's promise to us. And why do we know that? It comes from our first line of the text. Again, the very first line of the text is, I am the Lord and I will not change. And what does that mean? It means that God will always be gracious, that God will always be loving, that God will always be kind, always merciful, always gracious, always understanding, that God is always giving. God is the great, great giver. Notice, during the 400-year period after Malachi, the people sometimes gave and they sometimes didn't. And then Jesus comes into the world in the first century and lives 33 years. And sometimes they listened to Jesus and sometimes they didn't. But that didn't stop Jesus from going to the cross for all of us, for dying for us, because God does not change. But this leads me to my last and most important point. The most important choice of our lives is that we get to be a part of the work of God in this world. We have a lot of choices right now, don't we? We have a lot of choices about where to live. We have people deciding to move to different places. We have a choice about whether to marry or not, or who to marry. We have a choice about where we will work. We have a choice in this new year about how we will approach this. Will we approach this time with hope and optimism, or will we approach it with desperation and pessimism? We have so many choices. But the most important choice that you and I will ever make, the one that God puts before the Israelites, is whether they will be a part of God's work in the world. I'm going to try to give this last illustration without crying. You know that for 21 years, Jackie has come at 7 a.m. She's left around 5:30. She's run more photocopies and before that mimeographs than you could count. She's planned more funerals and more weddings than you could imagine. She has helped with more programs. And here's a little thing you may not know. Before we had this incredible team of videographers and editors, she was the one recording our Sunday worship service every Sunday, I believe from an iPhone. And she said, it's all about trust. It's all about trust in God. And then we have asked her, was it ever hard to be a 10% tither to this church? She said, in 21 years of giving, I have never wanted for anything. But then she checked herself and she said, no, that's actually not true. She said, no, I've never needed for anything. God has always provided. And when I heard Jackie say that, I heard a voice come from heaven, and it sounded something like this: Amen, Jackie Gaynor. So I only have one last question for you today. Will you choose an adventure with God in this church this next year?